Okay,
Whenever you're ready.
so I did the Charleston Syllabus, and I struggled a lot with actually how to begin talking about this book because I feel as though it's very complex. So I'm going to start with the reason why the book was actually created to begin with, which is the event on June 17th in 2015 when Dylan Roof, who was a self-described white supremacist, walked into the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. And he sat down next to Reverend Pinky, and after about an hour of Bible study, he stood up and he said, "I'm here to kill black people." And he proceeded to shoot Reverend Pinky and then 8 other people, um, killing them, and left one person alive whose name was Polly Shepard, who was a 70-year-old church trustee, to go on and tell the story of what happened there in the name of white supremacy. So it's a very difficult and very heavy subject to understand. So the response to this was this hashtag on Twitter that was created by the editors of this book called Charleston Syllabus. So the editors are Chad Williams, Kadada Williams, and Keisha Blaine, who are all associate professors or assistant professors of history or African American studies, and they're all authors of some pretty well-acclaimed books as well. Within an hour of co-creating this hashtag, and went trending on Twitter, and they ended up getting thousands of submissions of different pieces of writing, um, different texts, novels, poems, films, songs, and primary source documents that could be used as a list of readings that educators can use to broach conversations in the classroom about the events that unfolded in Charleston to help explain why this horrendous act actually occurred. And so I was inspired actually by an event the year before with the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson. And they started a hashtag called the Ferguson Syllabus, and very similar results where they just got a whole bunch of reading. It's pretty neat how all that unfolded. So what they wanted to do was be able to create this foundation to study the Black experience and the meaning of race in modern history. And with all their collection, they decided to go back to the times of slavery in the United States, and then forward to modern times. The the different texts that are available in this book are all arranged by publication date, and they offer valuable information to the history of racial violence. And they provide context for the history of race relations in South Carolina and the U.S. and also globally, which I thought was kind of an interesting approach as well. And then it offers insight on race, racial identity, global white supremacy, and black resistance. So, which I think was very powerful in this because not only did it talk about racial violence and who perpetrated that violence, but also the numerous acts of resistance therein, which was very important, I think, for this context. So the book is split up into 6 different sections. The first, starting in 1845, with a piece written in 1845. The first section is called Slavery, Survival, and Community Building, and the first piece is actually a speech by Henry Highland Garnett. And he, just a little bit of history, he was the first black speaker to address Congress in 1865. I'm sorry, it was 1843 was the speech that was written, and it's a pretty well-known speech. Originally was called, I apologize, I don't actually have the original title written down, but it was originally called An Address to the Slaves of the United States, but then because of how influential this speech became, it was renamed or referred to later by the name Call to Rebellion. And it was given at the National Negro Congress in Buffalo, New York in 1843, and it was basically his approach to abolition, which was to empower slaves on plantations to pick up arms and fight the plantation owners. And Frederick Douglass actually opposed this approach publicly to the Congress, and Garnett still offered an hour and a half long rebuttal, but the convention in 1843 still ended up not sanctioning Garnett's approach to the abolition, but the speech still went down as one of the most influential speeches in favor of abolition in history. So I thought that was pretty interesting that it started the book off with that speech. Then the rest of that section just offers a history of the transatlantic slave trade and child slavery, and also the anti-black racism in the U.S. and the transatlantic world. And then again, it also highlights the efforts to resist slavery from black abolitionists and white abolitionists, and also slaves still in the system of slavery themselves. Then the book moves on to the second section of religious life, spirituality, and racial identity. And this really highlights the struggles of Africans and African Americans that they had surrounding their religious and spiritual beliefs. And talks about how they created different religious practices, identities, and institutions to help develop understandings of faith, justice, and forgiveness. And I feel like the editors do well in picking different pieces to sort of give explanation of how later movements and during like Reconstruction and then into the 20th and 21st centuries were empowered by this earlier development and understanding of African American faith. The third section then goes into the Civil War and Reconstruction, and it highlights a lot of different texts about the misconceptions that many Americans today have about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it helps to understand different debates around the Confederate flag. So keeping in mind that Charleston is in South Carolina and the Confederate flag was in the state building up until just a few years ago was one of the bigger motivations I think that they had over addressing these issues with the Confederate flag. They took different passages out of the Constitution of the Confederate States, which I thought was a really interesting and well-chosen piece to take. And then also they took the document from the secession of South Carolina as well. Thank you. So they had actual like archival evidence as well to help with the different information they provided. The fourth section goes on to Jim Crow, racial politics, and global white supremacy. And this highlights a lot of different lawsuits and the armed self-defense movements and coordinated efforts by a lot of different African-American resistance groups. So it was like the earlier days of organization. There's a lot of poetry in this section. One of the poems that I enjoyed the most, I think, was by Claude McKay, If We Must Die, and that was written in 1919. And then you have a speech by A. Philip Randolph called A March. And then one that I had no idea even existed, which I actually found, I loved this piece, which was by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it was written in 1920. It's called The Souls of White Folk, which I had no idea he wrote that, but maybe that's just, I didn't realize. The fifth section comes into the civil rights and black power movements. And it gives a national and international scope of activist efforts into the 1970s. And it also explains that the civil rights movement and black power movement laid the foundation for the 21st century of black politics. And a lot of the pieces they chose kind of interconnected the two social movements between black power and civil rights. And then the sixth section in the book was from the 1980s into today. So the Black Lives Matter movement, and it talks a lot about different response articles to the Charleston massacre and whatnot. And it's called Contemporary Perspectives on Race and Racial Violence. There was one article in here that I thought was excellent, and I thought it summed up the book very well, and it's called Ella Taught Me, and it's by Barbara Ransby, and it was written in 2015, and talks a lot about like this common notion that the next civil rights movement is going to be held on Twitter, and there's a lot of criticism around that because there's no centralized leader, and a lot of critics think that the movement is going to go nowhere because of that. But this article really refutes that notion that the current movement is leaderless and will fail because of that. And the author Ransby talks a lot about how Ella Baker and her philosophy and leadership is really represented in the current movement. One of the quotes that she took from Baker was that leadership is a process of social influence in which a person can enlist the aid and support of others in the accomplishment of a common task. And she kind of uses that quote to explain how the Twitter movement is just a small facet of this larger movement, and there's many leaders therein. That was
One quick weakness?
One quick weakness. It was overwhelming at first, but they compensated with that because of the way they uh, put it together. They put it together actually in a couple of different ways. There's actually a longer online list that's together by topic, not by publication date.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah.
Can you turn the recording off for us? Ooh.